I drove 900 miles from Louisiana to Georgia to attend my grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary. Just as I pulled into the driveway, my aunt texted, "Party postponed to next month. Don't waste your time." But I could see the house. I could hear the music. They were already inside celebrating without me. I was about to walk to the front door when a text from an unknown number appeared on my phone. "Don't interrupt them. Stay in your car and watch what happens in 5 minutes." I want to tell you first about what the drive meant before I tell you what happened at the end of it. My grandparents have lived in the same farmhouse in rural Georgia for 53 years. My grandmother was born 17 miles from that house. My grandfather drove from a neighboring county to court her when they were both 19 years old, made the trip every weekend for 2 years, and eventually convinced her father to let him stay. He has never really left. That is the honest version of their love story, and it is the version my grandmother tells at every occasion where someone asks, which is every occasion, because she never gets tired of it, and neither does anyone who hears it. 60 years of marriage, 53 years in the same house. My grandfather still drives the same route he drove to court her, just to say he did it. I grew up spending summers there. Every June, from the time I was 5 years old until I left for college, I would arrive at that house with a suitcase and a level of excitement that I now understand was only possible because the place meant something to me that I couldn't have articulated then. It was the smell of it first. My grandmother kept a garden behind the house that she tended every morning before the heat came, and by the time you were awake, there was always something on the stove, and the whole house smelled like whatever she'd brought in. Basil and tomatoes in early summer, peaches later, the sharp sweetness of muscadine grapes in August. My grandfather drank coffee from the same ceramic mug every morning, a green one with a chipped handle that had been a gift from someone decades ago and that he refused to replace because he said it still worked fine, and he saw no reason to introduce a new mug into a system that was running smoothly. I don't know exactly why that detail stayed with me, but it did. The green mug, every morning without fail. There were other details too, the kind that only accumulate through years of the same place at the same seasons. The way the floorboards in the front hallway had a specific creak pattern that I had memorized so thoroughly by age 10 that I could walk through the house in total darkness without making a sound. The wooden swing on the back porch that my grandfather had built himself and repainted every few years without ever changing the color, which was a particular shade of green that matched nothing else on the property and that he had chosen, as far as I could tell, purely because he liked it. The glass candy dish on the side table in the living room that my grandmother kept filled with a specific hard candy that I have never seen for sale anywhere and that tasted like nothing so much as those summers, sweet and slightly floral and difficult to describe to someone who hasn't had one. My grandmother taught me to make biscuits the summer I was 9. She didn't use a recipe, which frustrated me because I wanted to write it down and take it home. She said the recipe was in the hands, that you learned it by feeling when the dough was right, and that if I came back every summer, she'd make sure my hands knew it before I was grown. I did come back every summer, and by the time I left for college, my biscuits were almost as good as hers, which she acknowledged with a critical precision that I understood was her version of a standing ovation. My grandfather taught me to drive in the field behind the house the summer I was 13. Not legally, just the mechanics of it, the relationship between the gas and the brake, how to steer into a turn, how to judge distance. He was an extremely patient teacher, which surprised me because in other contexts, he was a man of few words and high standards. Behind the wheel of his old pickup truck in that field, something in him opened up. He told me stories about his own father teaching him, about driving down roads that didn't exist anymore, about the way the countryside had changed since he was young. It was one of the longest conversations I ever had with him, and it happened at 10 miles an hour in circles around a field of Georgia clay. I want to tell you these things because the drive down there is different when you've been making it your whole life, when you know the road by feel, when the landscape stops looking like Georgia and starts looking like the specific Georgia that belongs to a specific set of memories. Somewhere around the county line, the interstate turns into a 2-lane state road, and the 2-lane state road winds through a stretch of low hills with pecan orchards on both sides, and every time I've come down that road for as long as I can remember, something in my chest has released a tension I didn't realize I was carrying, like a key turning in a lock. I was 31 years old when I made the drive for the anniversary. I had not been back to that house in 14 months, which was the longest I'd gone between visits in my adult life. There were reasons for that, and the reasons were sitting in my phone in the form of a blocked contact. The care fund started with a group chat message. My grandmother had a cardiology appointment in the spring, 2 years before the anniversary. Nothing immediately serious. A follow-up from a routine checkup that had flagged something the doctor wanted to look at more closely. My grandmother was not worried about it. She mentioned it to my aunt, who mentioned it to the family in a message that made it sound considerably more urgent than my grandmother's own account of it. I learned later that my grandmother had described the appointment to my aunt as just a routine follow-up, nothing to fuss about. My aunt's message to the family described it as a significant cardiac event requiring specialized monitoring and possible intervention. The message was long and carefully written. I've thought about the craft of it many times since. My aunt struck the exact right balance between alarming and hopeful. Alarming enough that you felt the urgency, hopeful enough that you didn't panic. She wrote about the cost of specialized cardiac care, about how Medicare didn't cover everything, about the possibility of ongoing treatment that could stretch over months months or even years. She wrote about the importance of my grandparents feeling supported without feeling like a burden to their family. She said she had set up an account to collect contributions, that she would personally manage the disbursements, and that she would provide updates as she received them from the doctors. It was the kind of message you read and then immediately forward your payment information, which is what most of the family did. I watched the group chat fill up with responses over the course of that day. My uncle, who lives in Florida, sent a message saying he'd transferred $500 and would send more if needed. My cousin, who had just started a new job, said she was sending $250 and was sorry she couldn't do more right now. Another cousin, the one I always liked, who used to chase fireflies with me in my grandparents' backyard when we were little, sent a message saying he'd wired $1,500 because my aunt had reached out to him privately to explain that my grandmother needed a specific medication that insurance wouldn't cover, a medication that cost $1,200 a month and that the doctors considered essential, $1,500. He sent it in one transfer within hours of the message. I sent $800 that same evening. I remember the specific amount because I had to pull from 2 different accounts to make it work. I was between pay periods and my savings weren't where I wanted them to be, but these were my grandparents, and the message had been clear about the urgency, and $800 felt like the minimum I could responsibly send. A week later, I sent a follow-up message to my aunt asking for a breakdown. I kept the message friendly. I said I knew she was managing a lot and I wasn't trying to add to her workload, but I wanted to understand how the fund was being deployed, what my grandmother's treatment plan looked like, what had been paid out so far, whether there was a projected total we were working toward. I said any level of detail she could share would be helpful, even just a general update. She did not respond to that message. I waited a week and followed up again. Still no response. I sent a third message 2 weeks after that, shorter this time, just asking if she'd had a chance to see my earlier messages. 4 days after the third message, I noticed that she was no longer appearing in my contacts. I tried to look her up in the group chat and couldn't find her. I went to her profile directly and found that I had been blocked, not just on that platform. When I tried to reach her through a different one, I found I had been blocked there too, same on a third. She had gone through the trouble of blocking me on every platform individually, which takes a specific kind of deliberateness. That is not an accident. That is a choice. I sat with that for a while. I tried to find an innocent explanation. Maybe she'd had some kind of personal crisis and was retreating from communication generally. Maybe there was a conflict I wasn't aware of. Maybe she'd blocked everyone because she needed space from the whole family, and I just happened to be the first person who noticed. I looked at the group chat to see if anyone else was missing. Nobody else was missing. I checked a few of my cousin's profiles. All still there. My aunt had blocked one specific person, and that person was the one who had asked for receipts. I want to be very clear about how that felt. I was not angry, not at first. What I felt was something closer to the cold clarity you get when a thing you suspected but didn't want to believe suddenly becomes confirmed. The $800 was not the point. The point was that my grandmother had a cardiology appointment and my aunt had turned it into a story, and that story had generated some amount of money from the family, and now the one person who had asked a reasonable question about where the money was going had been eliminated from communication. That is not confusion. That is a pattern. I tried to call my grandparents directly. The first time my aunt answered. She was staying with them that week, she said, helping with appointments. She said my grandmother was resting and couldn't come to the phone. I asked how the cardiology situation was going. She said it was being managed. I asked if there was a treatment plan I could look at. She said she'd have to check with the doctors about what was appropriate to share. She said she'd pass along my love. The second time I called, 2 days later, my aunt answered again. This time, she said my grandfather was in the middle of something and couldn't talk. I asked to speak to my grandmother. She said my grandmother was at the doctor. I said I'd call back later. She said she'd let them know I called. The third time, the number went straight to a voicemail that had never been set up. The recording said only that the mailbox was full. I sent an email to my grandmother's address, an address I'd been using for years, one she checked regularly. I kept it simple. I said I'd been trying to reach her and was having trouble getting through, and I just wanted to hear her voice and make sure she was okay. I asked her to call me when she had a chance. I never got a response. I called my cousin, the one who had sent $1,500, and asked him if he'd heard anything from my aunt about how the fund was being used. He hadn't. He'd sent his own follow-up message a few weeks after the initial collection, asking for an update on my grandmother's treatment. My aunt had replied to that one with a short message saying things were progressing and that she'd have a fuller update soon. That fuller update never came. He hadn't pushed because he told himself my aunt was busy, and he figured no news was probably good news. My grandmother must be doing okay if there wasn't some new alarm being raised. I asked him to try calling the house phone right now while we were on the phone together. He did. My aunt answered. He didn't identify himself immediately. He said he was looking for his grandmother and asked if she was available. My aunt said she was unavailable right now, but she'd pass along the message. He said it was a little urgent. My aunt said she understood and she'd make sure to tell her. He hung up. She's screening the calls, he said. I already knew that, but hearing someone else confirm it was different. It meant I wasn't operating on suspicion anymore. I started doing the math. My uncle in Florida, $500. My cousins, $250. The cousin I was talking to, $1,500. Me, $800. Those were just the people I knew about in detail. The group chat had 40-some members and not everyone had responded publicly. If even half of them had given something at an average of $300 or $400, The total was well into 5 figures, and it had been running for 2 years. I asked my cousin if he'd talked to anyone else in the family about it. He said he'd mentioned it to one of the older aunts, not the aunt in question, a different one, someone he trusted, and she had told him she'd also sent money and also hadn't heard anything back when she followed up. She had told herself it was fine, that she was probably just not on the update list, that surely the money was going where it was supposed to go. She hadn't wanted to make trouble. None of them had wanted to make trouble. That's how it works. That's the specific calculation that a person running a scheme like this is counting on, that most people, when they send money to help an elderly relative and then don't hear anything back, will assume the best, will not want to be difficult, will talk themselves out of the suspicion because the alternative is too ugly to sit with comfortably. My aunt had read the family correctly. She had built the whole structure on the accurate understanding that most of us would rather be wrong in the charitable direction than make an accusation that turns out to be unfounded. Most of us. I was the one who had asked for receipts. I told my cousin I was thinking about driving down for the anniversary. He said that seemed like a good idea. I took 4 days off work. I managed the leasing operations for a small commercial property company, which is a job with a lot of moving parts, but one that can be managed remotely when nothing requires my physical presence. I wasn't in the middle of anything that required my physical presence. I told my boss I had a family situation in Georgia. She said fine and asked if everything was okay. I said it would be. I spent the evening before I left pulling together everything I'd saved. The original group chat message, my 3 follow-up messages, and the non-responses. The dates I discovered I'd been blocked on each platform. Notes from the 3 phone calls, which I'd been keeping in a document on my phone after the second one because I had the feeling I might need them later. My cousin's account of trying to reach his grandmother through the house phone and getting my aunt instead. The older aunt's confirmation that she'd also contributed and also heard nothing back. Everything in one place in order, time-stamped. I packed light. 3 days of clothes, a toiletry kit, my work laptop. The silver-framed anniversary photograph I'd been working on for months. I had reached out to a cousin of my mother's who kept boxes of old family photographs and eventually found a print from my grandparents' wedding, the original taken on a small camera by someone standing off to one side of the reception. My grandmother looking over her shoulder with a laugh caught mid-sentence. My grandfather looking at her with the specific expression of a man who cannot believe his own luck. I'd had it professionally restored and printed and framed. It was the kind of gift that takes thought and time, and I had been proud of it. I still was. I set my alarm for 4 in the morning. I lay in bed for a long time before it went off. The thing I kept coming back to was the possibility that I was wrong. Not wrong about the pattern, the blocking, the screening. The unanswered messages were all real, but wrong about the conclusion. Maybe my aunt was in over her head and had spent some of the money on legitimate things and couldn't account for the rest and was too embarrassed to answer for it. Maybe she'd had some kind of personal financial crisis and borrowed from the fund intending to pay it back. These were not exonerating scenarios, but they were different from what I was actually thinking, which was that she had collected money from 40-some family members over 2 years under false pretenses and had never spent $1 of it on my grandmother. I thought about my grandmother, her cardiology appointment, which by all accounts, including my grandmother's own account, which I was only getting third-hand, had been routine. Her email, unanswered. The number going to a voicemail that had never been set up. I thought about the $1,500 my cousin had sent because his grandmother needed a specific medication that insurance wouldn't cover. I thought about the green coffee mug. At 3:47, I stopped trying to sleep and got up. I left before the sun came up. The Louisiana pre-dawn is its own specific atmosphere. The air heavy and warm even at 4 in the morning. A particular stillness that doesn't feel quiet so much as it feels held, like everything is waiting for something. I drove through the empty streets of my neighborhood and onto the interstate with a thermos of coffee and the radio off. I didn't want music. I wanted to think. The drive to Georgia from where I live goes through Mississippi and Alabama before it crosses the state line. That's 3 states, and each of them takes long enough to feel like its own distinct experience. Mississippi in the early morning was flat and fast, the interstate opening up through stands of pine and low wetland. The miles coming easy because the road was empty and the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. I stopped once for gas at a station outside of Hattiesburg, used the bathroom, refilled my thermos, got back in the car. Alabama is where the geography starts to change. The land lifts slightly and the road begins to curve, and the sky looks different, wider somehow, more room between the highway and the horizon. I drove through Alabama in the middle of the morning, and the traffic built around Birmingham, which slowed things down for about 40 minutes before opening back up. That stretch is always the hardest for me because you're far enough from home that turning back feels impractical, but still far enough from your destination that arriving feels abstract. The middle part, where you're neither here nor there. I ate a gas station sandwich somewhere in eastern Alabama. It was not good. I ate it anyway. The rain came through around 1 in the afternoon, a heavy band of it that crossed the interstate fast. The kind of rain that drops visibility down to almost nothing and makes the whole world disappear into gray. I slowed down and let the traffic around me slow with me, and for about 20 minutes I just followed the taillights ahead through the curtain of it. Then it passed as fast as it had come, leaving the highway wet and the sky opening back up into actual blue. I thought about my grandmother during most of that drive. Not sentimentally. I thought about her practically, specifically, the The way you think about a person you're genuinely worried about, whether she knew what was happening, whether she had any sense of what the fund had become. My grandmother is not a naive person. She is 81 years old, and she's been running a household and managing complicated family dynamics for 6 decades, and she is not someone who would miss this kind of thing entirely. But she is also 81 years old, and she had a health situation that had required some level of attention, and she trusted the people around her because she had spent 60 years building a family on the assumption that trust was warranted. I thought about the medication, the one that insurance wouldn't cover, the $1,200 a month medication. I thought about whether my grandmother actually took that medication, whether she had ever mentioned it to a doctor, whether she even knew it existed. I thought about my cousin wiring $1,500 in the same afternoon he received a private message explaining the situation. I thought about how my aunt had been careful to contact him privately, not through the group chat, the individual approach, the personalization, the specific urgency calibrated to the specific person. I thought about how much planning that kind of thing takes. The group chat message, crafted with the right balance of alarm and hope. The private messages to individual family members with individually tailored details. The screening of the house phone. The systematic blocking of the one person who had started asking questions. None of that is impulsive. All of it is deliberate. The Georgia border came up around 4 in the afternoon. There's a welcome center just inside the state line where I've always stopped. For no reason I've ever been able to fully explain, except that it marks the transition, and I've always felt the need to acknowledge it somehow. I stopped and stood outside for a few minutes in the Georgia air, which is different from Alabama air in a way I couldn't describe scientifically, but can recognize the moment I'm standing in it. Warmer, thicker, smelling of particular things. I stood there for a minute or two, and then got back in the car. 40 miles to the county line, 20 more on state roads, the familiar stretch with the pecan orchards on both sides. I drove it slowly, the way I always drive that road. The trees in late summer were full and heavy, the afternoon light coming through the canopy in long gold bars across the asphalt. I had driven this road maybe 40 times in my life, and I would have recognized it in the dark. I recognized it in the near dark, which is what it was becoming by the time I turned onto my grandparents' road and came up the long, shallow grade toward the farmhouse. The house was lit from every window. I could see it from a quarter mile away, the warm glow of it against the darkening sky, the shapes of vehicles on the lawn, the sound of music carrying clearly across the open field between the road and the front porch. My grandparents' house has a long gravel driveway that curves up from the road and opens into a broad space in front of the porch. The curve is gentle enough that you can see the whole front face of the house before you've finished pulling in. I have made that curve so many times that I do it by feel, easing through the last few yards of gravel without thinking about it. I parked at the edge of the lawn, behind a line of cars I didn't recognize, and turned off the engine. Through the windshield, the house looked like everything I remembered it looking like, and also like something I was seeing from a very long distance. I could see the people moving behind the windows, the shapes of them lit from inside, passing back and forth in the warm yellow light. The music was something my grandmother had always played at gatherings. I recognized the record even from where I was sitting. She had it in a cardboard sleeve on the third shelf of the bookcase in the living room, between a hymnal and a Georgia road atlas. She has played it at every gathering I can remember, going back to the birthday party she organized for the grandchildren when we were small. The faded blue cover, the artist's name worn almost to illegibility from years of handling. The fact that it was playing now meant she had set it up herself. She was in there. On the passenger seat beside me was the framed photograph. I had wrapped it in tissue paper inside a flat craft paper box for the drive, carried it carefully, moved it from the back seat to the front somewhere in Alabama so I'd be able to reach it when I got out of the car. The frame was silver, heavy for its size, simple enough that the photograph did its own work. My grandparents at their wedding reception, caught mid-moment. My grandmother's laugh, my grandfather's expression. 60 years ago. I had thought about presenting it during the toast, making a small speech about what the image meant to me. I had rehearsed some version of that speech during the Alabama stretch of the drive. I reached for my phone to check the time. The notification from my aunt was already there. Party postponed to next month. Don't waste your time. I read it twice. I looked at the house. I looked back at the phone. I looked at the house again. The music was still playing. I could hear actual voices now. Someone laughing at something near the front of the house. The creak of the porch boards. Postponed. I was sitting 40 feet from the party, and the party was obviously, completely, unmistakably happening. I understood what she was trying to do. She was trying to make me turn around. She had been watching for my car, or had someone watching, and she had timed the message to catch me at the last possible moment, close enough that she could see I'd arrived, but early enough that she thought she could still redirect me. She thought that if she sent the message now, I would read it and assume I'd made some mistake about the date, and I would turn my car around and drive 14 hours back to Louisiana, and she would have one more month to keep my grandparents separated from everyone who had been asking questions. The second text came from a number I didn't recognize, with a Georgia area code. Don't interrupt them. Stay in your car and watch what happens in 5 minutes. I set the phone on the dashboard where I could see it and leaned back in the seat. The car was still warm from the drive. I rolled both front windows down and let the Georgia evening come in. The smell of it, cut grass, something floral from whatever my grandmother had planted in the beds along the porch railing, the faint faint sweetness that I had always associated with this specific property and that I had never been able to identify exactly. My grandparents' home has a smell the way all places you love have a smell. You can't replicate it anywhere else. It's made of too many small things. The specific wood of the floors, the particular detergent my grandmother has always used, the garden, decades of meals and seasons and small ordinary days accumulated into something that hits you the moment you step through the door and that you can't break down into its components no matter how hard you try. I had missed it for 14 months. The music from inside was clear now that both windows were down. I recognized the record precisely. My grandmother had played it at every gathering for as long as I could remember. At Easter dinners and Thanksgiving, at the summer birthday parties, at ordinary weekend evenings when she just wanted something in the background while my grandfather read. The fact that it was playing meant she had set it up herself, which meant she was okay, which meant she was in that house right now, surrounded by family and music, and she had put on the record she always put on, and that should have been a simple, uncomplicated relief. It was a relief, and underneath it was the other thing, the question of what was about to happen in 5 minutes, and how much of it had already been arranged, and by whom. I thought about the text from the unknown number. Stay in your car and watch what happens in 5 minutes. 5 minutes is specific. That kind of specificity implies that the person who sent it knows exactly what's going to happen and when. They're not asking me to wait and see in the hope that something might develop. They're telling me to be ready, telling me to have my eyes open, telling me the window is this one right here. Whoever sent it was inside that house, or had someone inside that house, and they had been waiting for me to arrive. I looked at the time. 4 minutes had passed since the text. The music stopped. The silence came first. Not the silence of a party that has ended, but the specific silence of a room that has been called to attention. All the individual threads of conversation and movement gathering and then going still. The ambient noise of 40 people in a house collecting itself into the single sound of a glass being tapped. My grandmother's voice carries differently than you'd expect from a woman her size. She has always been small, and her voice is not loud, but it has a quality I don't have the right word for. Clarity, maybe, or precision, the kind of voice that doesn't compete with other sounds, but simply arrives in whatever space is available, clean and complete. When she speaks in a room, people listen. I don't think she's ever fully understood how much authority she carries, or maybe she understands it perfectly and has simply chosen never to let it make her difficult. Through the large front window, I watched her move to the center of the living room. She moved slowly but deliberately, the way she always has, unhurried, with an authority she's never needed to raise her voice to achieve. She was wearing something I didn't recognize from outside, a dark blue dress with a small pattern, something she'd bought for the occasion. Her silver hair was done carefully. She held the glass in both hands in front of her, the way she holds things when she is being formal, and the room settled around her without her having to ask it to. She thanked everyone for making the trip. She said that 60 years was a long time, and she was grateful for every person in that room who had been part of it. She said my grandfather was the same man she had married, only better, which got a laugh from somewhere near the back. She said she hoped everyone had eaten enough, which got another. She said that before she handed the evening over to my grandfather for the formal toast, which she noted was always longer than expected, she had one thing she wanted to address. She said she had recently become aware of something she felt the whole family should hear together. She said that over the past 3 years, she understood there had been a family care fund, collected in her name and my grandfather's, organized to help with their medical expenses. She said she wanted to acknowledge the generosity of everyone who had contributed. Said she was moved to learn how many people had given and how much. Said she hoped those people knew how much it meant to her that they would do that they would give like that without being asked directly, without knowing for certain what was needed. She paused there and let that land, let people feel for a moment like the thing they had done was what they thought it was. Then her voice shifted, just slightly, just enough, and she said there was one question she had not been able to answer. She looked directly at my aunt. I'd love to know where the money went, because my bank account has never received a single dollar of it. The room went completely still. I watched it happen through the glass from 40 feet away, and I have thought about what I saw many times since, trying to find the right description for it. It wasn't a collective gasp. There was no sudden movement, no intake of breath. It was more like a kind of suspension, everyone in the room arriving simultaneously at the same moment of recalibration, understanding at the same instant that what they had just heard was not the end of a sentence, but the beginning of something much larger. The conversations that had been paused for the toast did not restart. The people who had been half turning away or reaching for their glasses froze mid-movement. I could see my aunt's back from where I was sitting. I could see the exact moment the words landed, the slight tilt of her head, like someone hit with something small and fast, the way her hands moved to the table beside her and then stopped. Her shoulders rose by a fraction and held there. She did not turn around immediately. She stood absolutely still, and in that stillness, I understood that some part of her had always known this moment was possible, had always known that the structure she'd built could not hold indefinitely, and that she had simply been running out the clock and hoping it would hold long enough. Around her, I could see the rest of the room beginning to process. My cousin, the one who had sent $1,500 for the medication, was standing near the back, and I watched him very slowly lower his glass from his mouth without drinking from it. He set it on the table beside him without taking his eyes off my grandmother. A woman near him turned and said something quietly. He shook his head. On the other side of the room, near the kitchen doorway, I could see another figure, the older aunt, who had also sent money and also heard nothing back, standing with her hand pressed flat against the door frame, like she was bracing herself. My grandmother did not raise her voice. She stood in the center of the room with the same stillness she'd had since she tapped her glass, and she waited. She let the silence do what silence does when it's allowed to run long enough in a room full of people who are all doing the same math at the same time. She has always understood something about the weight of an unfinished sentence, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room is ask a question and then simply wait. Give everyone enough silence to arrive at their own answer so that when the answer finally comes, it belongs to all of them. After what felt like a very long time, less than 20 seconds by the clock, much longer by feel, she said, "My attorney is here tonight." She said it simply, without particular inflection, the way you'd mentioned that the porch light was on or that there was food left in the kitchen. A statement of fact that happened to carry the weight of an ending. "We can discuss it now, in front of everyone, or he can reach out to you Monday morning." I hadn't seen the attorney from my window. He was sitting in the corner of the living room that wasn't visible from where I was parked. A man in a dark suit who had been quiet enough through the earlier portion of the evening to go unnoticed. He was not unnoticed now. Several people near him turned to look at him, and he looked back steadily without particular expression. He had the look of someone who had been in rooms like this before and was not alarmed by them. My aunt finally turned to look at the room. I have thought a great deal about that turn. It was not the turn of someone who is going to fight. I know what that looks like, and this was not it. This was the turn of someone who is calculating very quickly whether there is any path through the room that doesn't require going directly through the thing standing in front of her. She looked at the faces around her. She was looking for something, an ally, a hand extended, someone who would offer an alternative reading of what had just happened, someone who would step forward and say that surely this could be discussed privately, that surely there was a misunderstanding, that surely my grandmother couldn't mean what she had so clearly just meant. The room gave her nothing. Not my cousin with the $1,500, who was still standing with his glass set on the table and his hands at his sides, and an expression on his face that I recognized from 40 feet away, because I'd worn something like it myself when I first understood what the blocked contacts meant. Not the uncle from Florida who had sent 500, not the older aunt at the kitchen doorway with her hand on the door frame, not any of the neighbors or friends who had driven out for the anniversary and were now standing in the living room of a house they'd come to for a celebration and were instead watching something they had not anticipated and would not forget. Not my grandfather, who was standing near the fireplace with his arms at his sides and an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger exactly, not in the theatrical sense, but a kind of settled finality, the expression of a man who has already had the conversation that mattered and is now simply watching its conclusion arrive. Nobody moved toward her. My phone buzzed on the dashboard. The screen lit up with a text from the same unknown number. "Now you can come in." I picked up the framed photograph from the passenger seat and got out of the car. The gravel was the same gravel it had always been. The same sound under my feet, the same particular give and crunch that I had been hearing since childhood. The porch light was on. The front door was standing open. I walked across the lawn and up the porch steps and through the door. The room, when I walked into it, was still in that suspension, that full stillness, but now the stillness shifted. 40 heads turning toward me. 40 people recalibrating again, this time to the figure who had just come through the door at the end of whatever this had been. I heard my cousin say something low and unintelligible. Someone near the back set a glass down carefully. My grandmother saw me when I was still in the doorway. She turned her head slightly, the way she does when something enters her peripheral vision that she was already half expecting, and for a moment the room was looking at me instead of at her or at my aunt. I looked back at my grandmother across the living room floor. In her expression was something I recognized from a lifetime of knowing her, the particular calm of a person who has done what they set out to do and is now simply watching the results arrive. She had planned all of it, not just the attorney, not just the public confrontation, all of it, the timing, the text from the unknown number, the 5 minutes, the person at the window watching for my car, sending the message that told me to stay where I was. That was arranged by her. She had known I was coming. She had known roughly when to expect me. She had spent some portion of the weeks and months before this evening understanding what had happened with the fund, finding the attorney, placing him in the corner of the room, designing the exact moment in which to use him. And she had needed a witness, someone who had been inside the situation from the beginning, who had sent money and asked questions and been blocked for asking, who had tried the phone and the email and found every path closed, who had driven 900 miles specifically because she could not be turned away by a voicemail or a group chat message. Someone to be present in the driveway when the answer to all of it finally came. She had sent me that text. I walked across the room to where she was standing and held out the framed photograph. She took the box in both hands and held it without opening it, looking at the craft paper wrapping for a moment, then looking up at me. Her eyes were clear, absolutely clear. It was Grandma.